Growing up, I was a big fan of city builder and city sim games. I remember playing SimCity 2000, I played Caesar 3, in fact Caesar 3 was one of the first games that I ever played, and I also spent quite a lot of time on both Zeus Master of Olympus and Pharaoh and Cleopatra. One of the things I enjoyed about these games is it felt like a puzzle with constantly shifting pieces. Sure, you can handle all of your people's basic needs, but something's always going to arise, and this is also why I was more drawn to that second category rather than the first one. In SimCity 2000, along with a lot of the more modern Enno games and Cities Skyline, you're managing a lot of day-to-day things. The bigger your city gets, the more complicated the management. But to start with, it's really not too bad. Of course, the more people you have, the more likely they are to commit crimes, die in their homes, leave all their faucets running for some godforsaken reason, maybe accidentally set their home on fire because, stuff happens and you just try to roast a turkey, but instead of putting the turkey in the microwave, you put the aluminum tray in the microwave, and all of a sudden here's the fire department. It can definitely be bad. However, I also remember taking my city to the point where I kind of got bored with it. I knew that it wasn't solved. I knew I could do better, optimize the routes, and probably prevent those people from setting their house on fire if I just made sure they were a little bit happier, had another grocery store, or possibly tickets to the next football game. But most of the time, there wasn't the threat of catastrophic and immediate failure. So I'd optimize my city to a point, and then start getting a little bit bored with it. At which point I dove into the cheat codes, realized that you could add Godzilla to your city in SimCity 2000, and never looked back. On the other hand, the reason I spent so much more time playing games like Caesar 3 is you weren't just in a sandbox. You had specific missions with tasks and goals. There were also always external threats. Sometimes entire blocks of houses would just catch fire for really no reason except that you're living in the desert, and your citizens did not appear to understand that building with flammable things and leaving uncovered fires in the desert is not a very safe house plan. But even if you weren't in the middle of a desert, there was always an earthquake, the wrath of the gods, yes, literal gods in this case, and invading enemies, including things like crocodiles, which were somehow scarier than the actual invading enemies a lot of the time. Don't get me wrong, sandbox modes can be great. Sometimes it's super relaxing to just kick back and play a sandbox city sim. And some of my fondest memories from Zeus Master of Olympus was after I'd beaten all the missions, going back and continuing to play them kind of like a sandbox and making the best city in all of Greece, with the most gods and heroes, the happiest people, you name it. One thing I don't miss was the fact that sometimes people couldn't find employment even though it was literally right in front of them, and you'd sometimes watch houses starve to death, and people leave the city not because there's actually a lack of food, but because they always turned left from their house, and for whatever reason the market was to their right. I wonder who could have planned that. The Impressions games had their quirks, and while they are still pretty playable today, and very fun, they're incredibly well-designed games, there are some nice things about modern city builders as well. Which brings me to today's topic, survival-focused city builders. These are games where failure is an option. You're going to build your city, and it's not always going to turn out right for you. In some cases, it's more likely to turn out wrong than right. We'll get into that one a little bit later, though. To start with, one of my favorite survival-focused city builders that leans a little bit more towards the sandbox side, and that is Surviving Mars. The reason I say it leans a little bit more towards the sandbox side is you're able to pick your difficulty. You can pick a fairly tame, fairly flat quadrant like the one you're seeing in the footage right now, or you can pick Hell has frozen over and you're on this godforsaken rock because a billionaire gave you way too much money to be here. Depending on your starting location, disasters will happen quite regularly. As it turns out, Mars might not be the best place for human habitation. But because you're on Mars and this is the future, you won't have to worry about some of the problems I mentioned earlier, like people struggling to find employment. Now, a lot of your basic tasks are handled by autonomous drones, and these drones are surprisingly good at their job. They don't pay taxes, unfortunately, but they also don't require wages. You never need to feed them, they run on solar and wind energy, which means they are 100% sustainable, and they will literally keep working until they're destroyed by a meteor. What this means is you can spread your colony across the entire quadrant, often with very large gaps between your buildings and habitable zones. As long as you've set up your automated networks correctly, all of that basic stuff, like getting the resources where they need to go, is handled automatically, and this is great. But resources themselves are surprisingly limited until late game. If you want water, yes, you can get some from a moisture vaporator, but that's only going to go so far. You're probably going to need to draw some from the Martian soil, and there really isn't all that much left. So if you take too long to set up a more permanent solution, you might end up running out of water and causing your colony to collapse. After all, yes, we're in the age of rocket ships, but people still need to drink, and they're going to go right back to Earth if Mars isn't turning out so green. Other resources like metal and concrete are also quite limited until late game, as are your total funds. There aren't really any gods in surviving Mars, but they do have the mysteries, giant overarching events that will often define the fate of your colony. If you pick a favorable starting location, this is towards the more tame end of survival games, and I really like the way the AI is optimized to handle a lot of the trivial tasks. This is why, despite it being a survival-focused city builder, I often see it as the sort of title where I can sit back, chill, and just build up my colony, explore a new mystery, and go from there. Because there are around 55,000 different starting locations, including different mysteries and randomized tech trees, each run feels a little bit different, and it's pretty rare for me to repeat a run unless I'm trying to do so intentionally. If I want to get into some challenges, those are also certainly an option. But what happens if you turn the difficulty in surviving Mars up to 11? Well, that might be like another game which I'm about to mention. Before I do though, we're getting pretty far into this video. So if you've been enjoying it, be sure to leave a like, and maybe subscribe for more content just like this, along with gaming news, reviews, and much more. If you want to pick up any of today's games, there will be some links down in the description, including to both Good Old Games and Steam via my Nexus. Where you can purchase games while also supporting me. A special thanks to the continued support of my patrons and YouTube channel members who make videos like this one possible, but more about that at the end. For now, what is one of the most brutal and awesome survival city sims I've ever played? Frostpunk. You are the lone survivors of humanity in a world that's slowly freezing over. Metal, coal, and wood are all heavily limited at the start. People are also limited. You're not facing an uncertain future. You're facing almost certain annihilation. This is the end of the human race. As time goes on, temperatures will fall. As temperatures fall, you're going to need to run your generator hotter and hotter, and if you can't keep up, your city will freeze over. Frostpunk is a game that epitomizes the phrase, actions matter. You're leading a small group of survivors, and they're not going to be too happy with the state of the world. Very often they'll ask things of you. Either their homes are too cold, they don't have enough food, or they're simply unhappy and wish to try to return to London. If you keep your word, then discontent will fall and hope will rise. If you break your word, hope will fall and discontent rises. If you mismanage things too much, people will die. If you do everything correctly, people will still die. And if you make enough mistakes, you might find yourself wandering the frozen wastes, alone and without a hope. Frostpunk city building is very different from all the other games I've played, because it uses a series of concentric rings. The closer to your generator a building is, the more easily it'll have access to heat. Your generator has multiple heating zones. Each time you expand the heating zone, though, you'll use more coal. Similarly, you can raise the temperature of the heat your generator outputs without necessarily expanding the heating zone. But again, each time you do this, you'll expend more coal. As the game begins, you start with a balmy -20 Celsius. Don't worry though. As storms roll in, it can get to a bone-chilling -80. You need to find enough food for the people in your city to survive. You also need to find enough resources to continue to keep the generator lit. After all, that is your only hope. And you have very few friends in this endeavor. Later on, you'll be able to send out scouting parties. They are able to find resources off in the waste, and they're able to find the few survivors who do remain. It's not too hard to convince the survivors to come join your city, as, after all, if they're doing that well, you probably wouldn't be running into them. But with each new person who joins the city, there's a new mouth to feed. A new person who might get frostbite or otherwise become injured and become an amputee. If amputees can't work, what do? Do you banish them to the wastes, or do you take care of them? These are the difficult choices you'll have to make in Frostpunk. And many of these difficult choices are codified in your book of laws. Very often, you'll be presented with one of two choices. One choice that's the right way to do things, that will overall make people happy, but could have long-term negative repercussions or require you to expend more resources. The other is often a quick and dirty fix. If there are people dying, you can build a cemetery, or you can just leave their bodies out in the cold. After all, they'll freeze and won't be a risk to disease. But no one wants to be reminded of their own mortality like that. And certainly no one wants to live with a pile of bodies right outside their home or place of work. What I like about Frostpunk is, I can go into every game expecting failure. It's not about if I'm going to fall to the frozen wastes. It's about when and how. How long am I going to be able to hold on? What can I do different? What can I do better? Maybe this time I advance my research a little bit faster, and I keep my generator warmer. But I also expand my city too fast. I take on too many survivors who are fleeing from the storms. And in the resulting chaos, I overtax my system. I don't have enough coal. The generator shuts off, and everyone dies. Or maybe another time, I didn't realize how important metal was. I didn't get to advance my research because I didn't have enough metal to do so. Ultimately, the temperature dropped too much, and I was unable to keep up. In Frostpunk, you're always in a race against time, and unfortunately, that's a race that time will always win. For me, the main reason why I prefer survival city builders, as opposed to the more sandboxy ones, is in the sandboxy ones, I often feel like I'm building the same city 100 times as I continue to play through the game. I get into comfortable habits, and very often there aren't aspects of a game that push me outside of those. Whereas, when I'm playing a more survival-based city sim, I have to constantly think and adapt. If I try to do the same thing in one mission as another, I'll run up against different constraints. To go back to the old Impression games, maybe I'm used to heavily relying on sea trade, but Neptune is angry at me, so now I don't have access to that. Or maybe I'm used to growing all my own food, but this mission has barely any arable farmland. It's in the middle of a desert, and I'm supposed to trade with my allies. On Surviving Mars, some maps have tons of concrete, others have almost none. Sometimes the world will regularly freeze, others there will be dust storms. If you're dealing with a dust storm, you have to worry about large networks of pipes and cables. They're more likely to rupture, draining your resources. But it also means that you can turn turbines into massive power generators during this time. So there's pros and cons, which means I'm more likely to build wind turbines as my primary power source in an area of higher elevation or one that has frequent dust storms. Whereas if everything freezes over, I have to keep my water lines running, cause pipes freezing and bursting is not ideal for human habitation. Frostpunk, on the other hand, turns all of this up to 11. Very often, I'll find myself scrounging. I'll find myself toggling things constantly on and off, just to make sure I can get through the next night. Maybe those steam generators are super critical during the day to keep those workplaces warm enough that people don't lose their hands to frostbite. After all, if people lose their hands, they can't work, and if they can't work, the city's going to collapse. But at the same time, if I burn coal through the night, then I'm going to run out of coal, and the city will collapse because the generator shuts down. Earlier, I mentioned that Surviving Mars was a very comfy and relaxing city builder. Frostpunk is the opposite. It's intense, it's visceral, and it's stressful, but it's also exhilarating. I've played a lot of city builders. SimCity 2000, Caesar 3, Zeus Master of Olympus, Pharaoh and Cleopatra, Banished. Several of the Anno games. I can't really remember the names because they're all just random years. I think there was one that was 2050 or something like that, 1400 something, 1600 something. You get the point. I've played quite a good few city builders. And more, I find myself drawn to the survival aspect rather than just the city building. I want missions. Don't get me wrong, sometimes a sandbox is great. But sometimes I want to have a definitive goal and a path to get there. But what about you? Do you tend to prefer sandbox-style games, or do you like the more directed and riskier survival games, where failure isn't just an option, it's a likelihood, at least until you get better at the game? And what are some of your favorite city builder games? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. And who knows, maybe one of them will appear as a review on this channel. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Your support helps keep me independent and allows me to turn down things like sketchy mobile game sponsorships. You can do so for as low as $1 a month over on Patreon. Or if you want to support me completely for free, then you can join the community by hopping into my Discord. link below. Or of course, you can just click the suggested video in the card right now. I hope you learned something today, and maybe I'll see you again sometime soon.